Alright, just a really short intro. As followers of the new movie diary know, my reviews always start with me singing over a video recording I've made in the past week. It's just one of my little quirks I can't seem to get over. I really like it. And this week, literally the day before I recorded this, I was at the New Jersey Convention and Exposition Center for the premier Darkside New Jersey Art and Oddities Market. Outstanding event with so many eclectic booths and attractions, among which was a performance by a pole dancing troupe named Creatures of Chrome. It was really serendipitous because I made a short video recording of one of their performances and I thought, wow, this would be a really interesting juxtaposition with this review's themes of women's empowerment and women's creative collaboration through dance. And the co-founder of Creatures of Chrome, the performer in the video itself that you're about to see, her name is Taylor Lynn, she was gracious enough to give me her consent to include this recording at the header of my review, so a big shout out to Taylor and all the great performers with Creatures of Chrome. You guys really killed it this past week. And if you're interested in learning more about Creatures of Chrome, of course I'll be including their socials in the description for this video. And should you like to see one of their performances yourself, Creatures of Chrome will be featuring this coming Tuesday, November 26th at the House of Independence in Asbury Park, New Jersey for an Emo Night pole show. Emo nights and pole dancing. That's what I call a millennial Reese's Cup. Anyway, with that, let's get into our review. I'm nobody because I'm everybody else, and I'm so clear that I'm not that guy. She continues to listen and crisscross her legs. This is the last place on earth that I thought I would find her. This is the last place on earth that I thought I would find her. Brilliant dancer. Man, I am thoroughly caffeinated right now. Hey everybody, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary, a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them in my humble opinion. And I'm very happy to be back on this channel after an extended leave of absence to deal with my mounting mental health crises and current events, to put it lightly. And I don't want anyone to worry about me out there, the 5 or so of you actually paying attention to this place. I'm doing fine, and right now I'm doing great, in particular because, given current events, I'm feeling particularly inspired to talk about a new film I had the pleasure of seeing this past Thursday at the lovely Metrograph Theater in New York City. The topic of this review is Becoming Giulia, the debut feature documentary by Swiss filmmaker Laura Care, which chronicles 3 pivotal years in the life of the titular Giulia Tonelli, a prima ballerina for the Zurich Opera, who, when the film begins, is just returning to the company just 4 months after giving birth to a new baby. Now, just the fact that Tonelli is returning to the stage at all, the fact that she is choosing to find a balance between her role as a new mother and her creative career is, of course, virtually unheard of in the world of stage dancing. Even within the film itself, there are these very touching but also very heartbreaking moments where Giulia will be talking to a fellow dancer who expresses her own desire to start a family, but feeling as though she is not ready to potentially forestall her career, or Giulia receiving a voice message from one of her friends who did retire once she became a mother and expressing her admiration for Giulia in charting a course for women in ballet to not feel like they must choose between their creative ambitions and motherhood. But I also don't want to give the impression that Care's film is limited in such a way that it is only about the struggles of being a woman attempting to find work and personal life balance. Indeed, I think one of the things that proves so inspiring and compelling about Becoming Giulia itself is that as Keir is following Tonelli not only through that aspect of her life, but also through the incredible workload she has to take on as a prima ballerina on its own, to her struggles with the subtle microaggressions, especially from male directors and choreographers in the Zurich Opera, through her collaboration with the choreographer Kathy Marston on the latter's own new ballet based on Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel The Scarlet Letter. Through all of these things that seem to pass so rapidly within the 3-year span that Kerr's camera follows Tonelli, what you think might be the focal point of the documentary's themes ends up taking a very conscientious backseat to what becomes a veritable adult coming-of-age story in which hard work and fortune ends up revealing what a limiting pretext, even the assumption that motherhood should be professionally limiting to a woman becomes. Tonelli even speaks to this directly to Kerr's camera at one point in the film, in which she stresses the often unspoken or implied framework in which women are encouraged, even in our supposedly more outwardly egalitarian culture with regards to gender, that women are very often encouraged to not take on too much. Not so much actively dissuaded in the sense of being told, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that, as they are subtly dissuaded by this patronage and condescension to the idea that, like, oh, you don't want to do too much, you don't want to push yourself too hard. I mean, your work is so valuable and your home life is so important. In other words, this idea that implicitly women can find themselves discouraged into feeling as though they must choose one path or the other. Whereas after making this decision, Kerr's film follows Tonelli to this point where she expresses how, no, the fact that I didn't choose between one or the other because I decided I wanted to pursue both my professional and family ambitions. Having my son hasn't been an impediment to me, but has only made me stronger as a person in general, but also in particular, as we see as the film goes on, as an independent artist in her own right. And as I was watching Becoming Giulia, I found myself so profoundly edified by just being able to perceive so frankly the extent to which that, even for Tonelli, this artist who is at the height of international prominence in a highly competitive field that is already so demanding both mentally and physically, who in addition to all that, like many of the other women around her, also has to speak so many languages fluently, not just her native Italian, but also Swiss German and French and English. This person who should have absolutely no reason to doubt herself, who should feel no reason to be discouraged. This person who, to ironically paraphrase the great Bill Burr's bit about Arnold Schwarzenegger, this person who has accomplished so much in what would take so many of us lifetimes to achieve, it becomes emboldening to our own sense of visceral offense at the idea that we still see this incredibly accomplished person, at least at first, feeling as though she must always defer and be nice and be non-confrontational, especially when it comes to sometimes quite dictatorial and non-collaborative approaches of the traditional, still male-dominated direction and choreography of the Zurich Opera. Which then, of course, comes increasingly to contrast with Tonelli's more holistic experience working with Marston, who, in the context of how Kerr arranges this narrative, becomes like this explosive, epiphany-bearing angel in a very stagey, very limiting, and rather oppressive world. And I do want to express how brilliantly and intuitively Kerr also brings aesthetics into things as part of the symbolic layers of how the understated aggressions against women are arranged in more traditional ballet versus this new path being charted by Marston and Tonelli and many other women artists. It's really thrilling to see Kerr's camera often literally chasing Tonelli all through the halls of the Zurich Opera as she goes from one rehearsal to another, only to end up on the stage where, more often than not, we get to perceive the productions of these ballets in a quite immersive and intimate, but still rather limited way, often behind backstage curtains or facades or obstructions, which heightens a sense of so many of these productions, whether it's Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet or Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker, or even more modern pieces like Forsyth's The Second Detail. We get this very distinct sense of a reliable formula and pattern to the Zurich Opera's productions in which there is this oppressive sense of darkness, of Baroque palettes in the costumes and sets, very harsh and contrast-emphasizing light sources, and above all, even as modern ballet has become increasingly open to performance styles like Tonelli's, which are more fluid in terms of body movements, but also more facially expressive in terms of communicating emotions to the audience, there is still this oppressive and formulaic sense of the dancers, especially the women, as kind of this ornamental mass moving routinely about the stage, whereas Tonelli's collaboration and rehearsal with Marston is notably not only more fluid, but more open in the sense that there seems to be a more corporeal resonance for Tonelli, as though the body is not just the vehicle for the form of the dance itself, but a way for the dancer to really embody and live through the character, and a theme that Marston herself is willing to be open herself to experiment, to not be dictatorial, but communicative with Tonelli, and let her help the choreographer define what the dance means beyond the style of the dance merely calling attention to and only commenting on the form itself. Boy, I hope Susan Sontag is looking down from heaven and smiling. You've helped me a lot, Susie. I wouldn't be half of who I am as a critic without you. One of my favorite parts of Becoming Giulia is when Tonelli and Marston are just meeting each other over a video chat, and Marston talks about her own career and how she used to try to balance narrative works with more experimental and interpretive pieces, but how at this point in her life she is primarily interested in telling stories, in depicting perspectives, and using dance to express emotions and popular narratives. And it's not long after that Tonelli is performing in a production of Messa de Requiem, directed and choreographed by Christian Spuck, which, you know, in the limited excerpt of it that we have in Kerr's film, could not more profoundly illustrate the logical, almost fascistic conclusion of the kind of dictatorial extremes of stage dance, where we're not even sure what we're watching or what emotions Tonelli as a dancer is supposed to be expressing, except that she's quite literally rolling slowly over the stage. And the behind-the-scenes context doesn't flatter Spuck much more, and I want to make clear here, I am not taking shots at Spuck's art. I'm no expert in ballet or stage dance, period, though anybody who has seen my review of Cedric Clepicius and Corpse from a year ago at this point, you'll know that I myself really love at least movies with dance in them, and I don't really discriminate that harshly between narrative dance and more formalistic dance. I wouldn't be surprised if Kerr herself, who is a retired professional dancer and choreographer herself, I wouldn't be surprised if she were to hear that opinion, and for how critically her documentary frames Spuck himself, I wouldn't be surprised if she were to go, you don't know what the you're talking about, shut up. But even still, it is so enthralling to see how Becoming Giulia frames so obliquely how dynamics of power and gender inequality aren't necessarily only expressed in, say, staging so many of these 19th century productions that are all seemingly about these very young ingenues whose primary role is to be in the thrall of these big, strong, older men, but also how these things are expressed literally in terms of aesthetics, and what these aesthetics can speak to about the behind-the-scenes limitations and condescensions and microaggressions faced by women artists, where Tonelli is so frustrated and lost in Spuck's contradictory combination of being so hyper-specific about what he wants and how he wants Tonelli to move her body so specifically, but being so poorly communicative in terms of actually getting her to the point where she can give him what he wants with confidence. I will also say this, another very subtle way the gender disparities play out behind the scenes and that Kerr renders so intuitively. It does not seem that among male artists, even among directors and choreographers, that there is the same expectations as there are for women in terms of communication, as in, like, actually being able to speak all these different languages fluently. Like, I get that English is sort of the reserve currency of languages in international theater and such, but it's clear that Tonelli can speak all of these different languages quite fluently, whereas Spuck's reserve English is not very good, and it's like, he's German, and Tonelli speaks fluent German. Why doesn't he just speak to her in German? Again, these very subtle examples of microaggression and condescension towards women if you're paying attention. And it's not just verbal communication. Things get very physical. The way that Spuck touches Tonelli when he's attempting to direct some of her movements in rehearsals seems very frustrated and intimidating and even a little violent. There's even one older male choreographer with the Zurich Opera in the film who, comparatively speaking, is much more holistic than Spuck is very demanding in particular, but at the same time, we at the very least get to see praise his performers when they get to where he wants them to be. And even he, while he's just walking down the hallway and Tonelli is having a conversation with someone and she doesn't see him coming, rather than just saying, "Excuse me," he literally takes her firmly by the arm and pushes her aside without a word of acknowledgement, as if he's still directing her choreography beyond the confines of the rehearsal itself. And what makes that moment for me all the more harrowing is just seeing how Tonelli, in that moment, doesn't seem to require a lot of force from him, so to speak. She seems offended, demeaned, of course, but she also seems to just respond so intuitively to that action on his part, almost as if she just knows who's touching her and the way and how she's supposed to respond automatically. Which you must suspect can only mean that she's dealt with that a lot in her career, that it's practically an entire fold in her brain now. This is what you do when someone grabs your arm. You just go wherever they put you. And it's galling because with all of her success, with all of her experience, with everything she's given, not just to dance in general, but to these choreographers and directors specifically so that she can receive their input and give them what they want, she would absolutely, in that moment, be fully entitled to play the diva and be like, "No, I'm sorry, we are not in rehearsals. This is not your choreography. You don't touch me without my consent. If you want me to move, you pull up your big boy pants and talk to me like one adult to another." But that's the whole thing, isn't it? And something, again, that Tonelli speaks very directly to Care, and notably in private, in her own home, in the ironic paradigm where her increased responsibilities in her home life are actually giving her more professional confidence, not less. She quite explicitly says to her own parents, there is this imperative in a lot of ballet and theater in general to keep performers infantilized, to keep them dependent on the choreographers and directors so that they can be more easily controlled, regardless of whether or not that makes them more comfortable and confident as artists themselves, and potentially from a different philosophical perspective, potentially able to give better performances than the material they are being dictated. And I'm so glad that in my typical style, I finally wound myself back to that domestic scene and that really beautiful sentiment that Care as a filmmaker narrativizes, because it demonstrates so clearly how many of Tonelli's epiphanies about herself over the course of this movie, these things that help her in her own professional and creative ambitions, have been born out of her own independent view of what it means for her to also have ambitions to build a family and raise a child and be a mother. If Becoming Giulia is about motherhood in any sense, it really is this more radical view of motherhood in which the persistent point, and not so subtly reinforced by Marston and Tonelli's interpretation of the Scarlet Letter of all things, the persistent point is that motherhood has not been a sacrifice that Tonelli has made. It has, in fact, made her stronger both personally and professionally, both in the domestic and the social spheres. So I can't help but think about not only what I've seen in this beautiful film, but the context of when I saw it. Becoming Giulia still doesn't have a firm US release date or even a US distributor as far as I'm aware. The only reason I even saw it was because this past Thursday at the Metrograph was literally the New York premiere of the film, coming off Care touring with the film for a month all over the United States, and man, what a f***ing month to be a woman director touring a film like this in the United States in a month like this. Even for as much as women's reproductive rights and medical autonomy has been rolled back all over this country in the last 4 years, we are, because of this right-wing ascendancy in not only the courts, but also in the executive and legislative branches of our government, we are really on the precipice of a utterly disastrous and monstrous reversal of even just the incremental gains in women's rights that have taken decades to achieve. And though Care's film might not at first blush seem to speak at all to questions of reproductive rights and medical autonomy, I wouldn't be too sure that the way that Becoming Giulia frames the power of motherhood, how it narrativizes a woman becoming stronger as an individual because she refuses to let a patriarchal society discourage her from taking on more than she can manage. I wouldn't be too sure that this film doesn't speak to exactly the same paradigm that we need to draw upon. We need to marshal, we need to vociferously propagandize as we attempt to marshal together and defend ourselves against this abhorrent reactionary onslaught against women's rights. I understand that for many people, it seems like the question of a woman's right to an abortion, for instance, comes down to philosophical considerations, whether you call it a fetus or an unborn child, whether you define a pregnancy as merely a medical phenomenon or a distinct personhood. I, on the other hand, am at the point in my life where I am increasingly of the opinion that this is all just semantics that pushes us further and further away from a central moral proposition that is going to be so important as we talk more and louder about what it even means to advocate for the rights of women, or even the so-called sanctity of life. Fundamentally, as a baseline, I think it is wrong to demand that one person give over their body to another person. I consider it wrong in the context of sex, and I consider it wrong in the context of sexual reproduction. I do not care if we define a fetus as a person. It doesn't matter to me because there is literally no other context in which we should ever tolerate that one human being be coerced into giving over their body to another human being. People who are capable of bearing children, whether they're cisgender women or trans men, these are the only context in which we've apparently decided that it's okay to do that, and it's fucking bullshit. And I don't know how likely it is that this message is going to reach any of the young men who need to hear this shit the most, especially any of you who are trying to be edgy and get your serotonin boost by telling women, your body, my choice on the internet. But I'm going to talk to them directly anyway because nobody needs to hear this more than them. It is categorically wrong to demand that someone else give over their body to another person. I don't care that I'm older and you're where you're at. You and I both know good and god well that if the shoe was on the other foot, we would never tolerate it for a second. If you're seeing your body, my choice, but not writing it yourself, do not just write it off as immaturity or grossness. That phrase could not illustrate more clearly and overtly that all of this having to do with the rights of the unborn or the sanctity of life or traditional gender norms, they are an extension of rape culture. The notion that it is incumbent upon a woman to give over her body to an unborn person is just an extension of the fundamental misogynistic predicate that women are expected to give over their bodies to men. If even a fraction of what I am saying is speaking to something inside you, that fundamental humanity that I hope is there, that you realize that if the roles were reversed, you would instantly recognize how horrific it was, then I need you to stop acting like a little boy, man the up, pull up your big boy pants, and talk and act and fight about these things as if it was your that was on the line. Again, I know this seems like a huge tangent, but I think what makes a movie like Becoming Giulia so important, and why I hope it finds a suitable distributor sooner rather than later, is because in obverse of that ethical position, we need an equally radical reframing of the paradigm about pregnancy and parenthood when a person capable of bearing children chooses that they want to have a child. This notion that having a child is a sacrifice that a woman makes is infantilizing garbage. A woman should not be expected to have a child as a sacrifice to her husband, to a family, to the child itself, or to society at large. We need a more radical way of thinking where we recognize that just as much as these reactionary cretins are deathly afraid of women gaining more autonomy and power by taking control of their bodies, they are also capable of doing it by realizing that their pregnancy, when they choose to go through it, is a source of power. It proves to them that they can take on the world and have more clarity about their inherent strength and potential, and thus not have to tolerate all this infantilizing and microaggressive bullshit from men. This is what patriarchy is afraid of women looking at their own bodies, their own potential, and being able to say, you know what? No, I don't consider this a sacrifice. Sure, it's hard, it's difficult, but the more of these responsibilities and ambitions I take on, the more I prove to myself my own strength. On the other hand, if you see it as such a sacrifice, I think that actually says something more about your fear and your weakness and your inadequacy and insecurity. I think it says something about how deathly afraid you are of what women are capable of achieving. I'm going to give Becoming Giulia a very affirmative 3.5 out of 5. Really keep an eye out for this one in the coming year. With that, I'm going to close things out. Really elated to be back and coming back with this review in particular. Thank you so much for watching. Please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.